Hello and welcome to this session. I'm Becky Telford. I'm the Chief of Education for UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency. And I'm really pleased to open this session on funding for impact, thinking about some of the students and children who have been left furthest behind and how we can collectively support them. In 2019, UNHCR hosted a global event called the Global Refugee Forum, where we brought together people from all different stakeholders and walks of life to think about some of these knotty issues and how we can work on them together. As part of that, we had an education co-sponsorship alliance made up of a huge number of partners, including the people on the panel today and who will be speaking. And from that alliance, we had 263 pledges. So people really looking at some of the major challenges we have in education for refugees and thinking about the specific ways in which they can be overcome. Since 2019, we've done a lot of work with the Alliance, thinking about how those pledges have been able to come together, but also really looking at the gaps and thinking about how we can support global change by asking the right questions. Some of the gaps that we found were accelerating progress for education for refugees. It's so necessary. I think we collectively have that aspiration, and it's doable. With the right partnerships, the right approach, bringing in refugees themselves, and the right financing, we can really make that difference. But there are still huge gaps, both in policy and in provision. This session features teams and allies from that alliance, and we're really excited to hear some of the ideas and some of the responses from the global minds here today. The pitches that you're going to hear are not projects necessarily that exist. They're ideas that people have when we look at the gaps and we think about the evidence that is out there at the moment and start opening up the plans and proposals for what else could work to push those solutions forward. They come on the back really of a combined reflection, and I think we're excited to share some of those thoughts about the critical areas that need support and some of the very granular ways of working that could come out of this. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jackie Strecker, who is our lead in connected education at UNHCR and who's going to chair the session. Thank you.
Wonderful. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a very impressive investors panel that's here with us today that are going to be helping to provide some reflections on the pitches that you're going to hear. So without further ado, I'm going to invite up Lauren, who's going to give our first pitch. And so Lauren, over to you.
Hello everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Lauren, and through my work at Learning Equality, I deeply understand the challenges of implementing EdTech initiatives in lower connectivity contexts. This is Ahmed, a refugee learner in Azraq refugee camp, who benefited from a subscription-based digital learning solution at a community center. When the funding for Ahmed's program stopped, he can no longer access the tool which supported him learning at his own pace. Sadly, stories like Ahmed's are not unique. With the onset of COVID-19, organizations around the world were praised for stepping up to offer free education technology. However, there are hidden costs of adopting free but not open resources, and we need to be smart about these investments, particularly as we face the reality of a prolonged global pandemic. There are a range of connected education solutions benefiting refugees and host community learners. But the sustainability of these solutions are intimately tied to the organizations who develop and maintain them, in addition to ensuring that the necessary infrastructure exists. Funders of connected education initiatives often aren't considering the ongoing end-to-end costs to support them. This is why I am proposing greater investment in generalized funding for free and open source education technology products. Typically, this funding either comes from the for-profits that develop the technologies or philanthropies that cater to specific user needs. But if generalized funding is made available, this means that software can be developed without costs for its use, and once an open license is applied, anyone can use and adapt the technology. But here's why I really think this is important. First, With free and open source product development, this enables software designers and engineers to focus on core and commonly needed functionality that's not biased by specific corporate or organizational needs. Second, open licensing allows for customization and adaptation of these tools so they can be extended and reused in new ways. Third, and perhaps most importantly, with free and open source, this means that the use of the software can continue indefinitely. It doesn't require line items and budgets for future licensing or subscriptions, and instead, funding for connected education solutions could instead be spent on building infrastructure and more sustainable capacity. In this way, developing free and open source education technology creates a public good. It is clear why investment in free and open source education technology will help us rewire education. Let's not reinvent the wheel if it's not needed. Let's ensure that learners like Ahmed have ongoing access to these useful learning tools. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. Danah, I'm going to come to you first. Any quick reflections from that pitch?
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Jackie. I particularly like the way that you thought about the hidden costs. I feel a lot of people get excited about the ed tech without thinking about the other things that are needed, particularly for people like Ahmed. The second thing I felt that was important was looking at the way that you looked at the funding in the sense in capacity building and then infrastructure and the open source that can be adaptable and not biased. So thanks for that.
Wonderful. So some really good food for thought there. Thank you. We're going to hear now from another pitch that's going to be brought to us via video, as Najeeba unfortunately wasn't able to travel here today.
Most refugees in the Asia Pacific live with few rights, and each year only 0.4% find permanent protection. We are losing generation of human potential. Refugees are frontline responders to crisis in their communities. This is almost always unpaid and means workers still need to find income, care for their immediate family, and find ways to deal with practical issues like lack of registration or language skills. But in the Asia Pacific, donors are not widely funding refugee leaders, and refugees are often left out of decision-making processes. This is again despite the widespread acknowledgement that meaningful participation of people receiving aid is the path to best outcomes. We also note that historically, refugees have been involved in designing significant frameworks, including the early days of the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees. The most powerful and transformative action that response sector can make is to enable refugees to influence decision-making, and supporting refugee-led education is a key piece to this systemic change. I have to say, education is a human right for everyone, but refugees face particular challenges because they are often excluded from national education systems and not given the support they need to find education opportunities. Right now, my country, Afghanistan, is a testimony of how important education is. Once you are educated, no one can take that away from you, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepares it today. There is a need for improved financing mechanisms for refugee education throughout the pandemic. Philanthropy in particular can be directed strategically to complement institutional and private sector funding during crisis. The difficulty of lack of resources for refugees, especially the refugee-led learning centers, the refugee schools, the refugee educational institutions, to carry out activities at the skills needed, being unable to formally register or access bank accounts in many parts of the world. And hence, many of our partners, many of our refugee colleagues are excluded from most official funding opportunities and are often reliant to support from diaspora communities abroad. The donor community has an outstanding opportunity to create this systemic change by funding, by investing, by resourcing refugee-led organizations directly, and more importantly, when we talk about education. The Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, we aim to do this by transforming the aid sector by example, and by directly funding refugee-led organizations in the region, and ensuring that we are able to provide them capacity building, capacity strengthening support as well, requested by those refugees. To do this, we have initiated an initiative named Refugee Leadership Alliance. Through the Refugee Leadership Alliance, which is a cross-sectoral regional initiative, our aim is to increase networks and, more importantly, funds and influence for refugee leaders in the region. The alliance was formalized in June 2021, and it is focusing on a range of initiatives, including capacity strengthening initiatives, including focusing on a pooled funding concept, which will support refugee-led organizations to thrive when they do access funds. Our plan is to raise $250,000 in 1 year to distribute amongst 8 refugee-led organizations in the Asia-Pacific region. More financial support can relieve the immediate financial pressure on these educational centers that I named, and a lot of them are struggling with their running costs, including rental payments, teachers' fees, internet costs, and providing stationery for students, which basically means better education for refugee kids, and also frees up time and resources to try and achieve structural improvements like organizing partnerships with international schools. I have to say, investing in education is investing in humanity. And with funding support, we are able to bring much more sustainable to the work of refugees in the region.
Wonderful. Becky, can I ask you to give a reflection on that pitch?
Sorry, I'm surprised. Absolutely, and thanks to Najeeba for that video. I think it was really inspiring. And I took probably 3 key points away from that. I think the first is, this phrase, nothing about us without us, including refugees in design, in decision-making, in co-creation, but really in leadership. Not because it's the right thing to do, but also recognizing that refugees themselves are the first responders. They're the first people there, first people delivering education, and the last, right? So really having refugees themselves at the center of these solutions is absolutely critical. I think the second thing is around the power of alliances. And I mean, we started off talking about alliances, bringing the right people together, bringing the right stakeholders together, supporting everyone to play their particular role and to fund where it's needed, I think is also critical. And the final thing is actually around how financial inclusion underpins everything else that's happening. I mean, she talked about the need to open a bank account, the need to be able to establish an organization, as yourself, as a refugee-led organization. And so that would be the final thing, thinking about not just capacity and resourcing, but actually the frameworks in which people can organize themselves and how we collectively can facilitate that. Thanks.
And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Judith for our third pitch.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm Judy Pitch, and I'm here on behalf of all EdTech solutions who have rigorous sort of evidence-based and proof of concept. And I'm going to explain to you why I think that investing in the missing middle, which I'll explain what it is, makes social and business sense. So why? Every dollar invested in education has a return of $10 to $15 in economic growth. And that has a multiplying effect and can make a huge contribution to all SDGs. And yet, there's a huge rift between that and what we see, actually, decline of investment in education. Scalable EdTech solutions are often thought about, a quick win here because they can scale. And yes, that's true, if they can get past the missing middle. For example, Can't Wait to Learn, we've looked into this, and in 4 years' time, if we reach enough scale, we can bring down the cost from 80 to 10 euros. And yet, why aren't so few getting there? Because between the stage of invention and the replicable solution, actually there's something that's called the missing middle, which is a little bit unknown, and I'll explain that a little bit. After having a pilot, you need to sort of add quite a lot of complexity in order to get to a really working solution. And once you're there, you can't scale it readily. You need to actually distill complexity and find other approaches to really bring it to scale wider. Like I said, this is called the missing middle. What happens there? You need to codify, you need to standardize, you need to package, you need to increase their agility, you need to invest in your software, you need to find new partnerships, think about business models and reorganize. And that needs yet another investment. This is perceived very often by donors as high cost and high risk. And I think that the benefits outweigh, the cost and the risk. Why? Because if you have proof of concept and a rigorous, sort of monitoring system inbuilt in your EdTech solution, then you've also accumulated a huge, enormous amount of wealth, capacity, and there is potential for enormous scale. And it would be absolutely waste, not to take it to the ultimate step. And we've also calculated that all the investment up to that moment really are much more than the investment that's perceived as high risk and high cost at that particular moment. So what is needed? Acknowledging there is a stage between invention and the final scale. Embrace the middle, the missing middle, and where it sometimes gets messy. Increase funding at organizational level, especially for small organizations. Unrestricted funds is important. Also, long-term and flexible funding is important at that stage, and funding into baseline. What's also very important is to think of all the organizational restructuring that needs to happen internally and externally, and build new partnerships, cross-sectoral, and also cross-pollinate with the private sector. So what are the gains if we invest into that missing middle? Real systems change, not just pilots that are brought to a certain stage, but at the end, return of investment, real impact, inspiration to others, and hopefully achieving the SDGs faster. Thank you.
Wonderful. That was excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pass it over now to our representative from Dubai Cares, Nada. Nada, any reflections on that?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, and I'm so excited that someone's finally talking about this. Oftentimes, we find a lot of our EdTech partners specifically who are so excited to come and pilot ideas, but I think not just them, but everyone around them are not, they don't have the interest or the commitment to carry through to the, to try the missing middle, to tackle the missing middle. So I think it's really important. I think I'd love to see how we can do that also with some of our programs. So I really like that idea.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nada. All right. I'm going to invite up our next pitch presenter, Lindsay. Over to you.
Can you hear me? Okay. We are in the midst of a learning crisis. And though children in conflict and crisis are increasingly enrolled in schools, they are rarely learning. But I argue today that we already have the technology available to increase student learning, but it's not a gadget or an app. It's the classroom teacher who helps bring content to life, who asks students questions, who cares if students are learning and thriving. I'm Dr. Lindsay Brown, and I believe in teachers because teachers have the single biggest influence over how much students learn in a given year. And in areas of conflict and crisis, their role is even more critical and far-reaching. But we not only overlook the role of the teacher in emergency contexts, we often cast them as the problem. But there is another way. We can leverage research to design high-quality teacher professional development for measurable improvement in teacher performance and student learning. We can partner with teachers and other educational stakeholders to select high-impact practices aligned with national and curricular priorities. High-impact practices are those that teachers use across grade levels and subject areas, like promoting classroom discussion or providing quality explanations. Imagine teacher A, who has attended sustained, research-based professional development in promoting classroom discussion. She was introduced to the practice and its components. She was shown specific examples and non-examples of concrete teacher moves, and she was given multiple opportunities to practice. As a result, she can use it across her lessons for things like helping students with problem solving, creating an inclusive classroom, and accommodating all learners. Because these practices were selected in partnership, they create a common vision of quality teaching across the system, a vision that will vary by culture and context, allowing for an approach that is both scalable and flexible. Teacher B, on the other hand, has been to some trainings on using a tablet-based scripted curricula. He really likes having the lessons, but he finds that the tasks are too challenging for his students, and he has never learned the high-impact practices of instructional scaffolding that would help him make the tasks more accessible. It's time that we stop implementing classroom interventions in emergency contexts that require skills that teachers don't yet have. By doing so, we squander limited resources and we prevent teachers from reaching their full potential, essentially ensuring that the most vulnerable students will not reach theirs. So I implore you to put your money into where research says it will have the greatest return on student learning into high-impact teaching. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. That was great. I'm going to hand it over to Euan for a comment.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Lindsay. That was great. I think particularly the piece that I liked there around the high leverage teaching practices and the link to innovative pedagogies as well, I think is really, really important. And how we bring out the characteristics of play within that, I think obviously from a Lego Foundation perspective would be great. Looking at the ambitions related to the collaborations with the ministry, with school leaders and teachers, I think really important. Again, that systemic link there as well. So we're linking them all together for that quality learning. And how the process of collaboration engagement across system actors supports that systemic impact as well. And importantly, I think how, as well as children's learning outcomes, but also looking at the broader holistic outcomes as well, which are super important. And the type of teacher training being proposed for teacher buy-in and behavior change also really important.
Great. Thank you, Euan. All right, so now up to our next pitch. Rita, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I represent the African Union International Center for Girls and Women's Education, which we cover the 55 African countries in the continent. The question that I want to ask is, why do some refugee girls make it in life and others not? I want to give you two examples of two young women, both refugees. Ilhan Omar, I'm sure you've heard of her, was only 8 when the civil war in Somalia began. Her family fled to Kenya as refugees and later moved on to the United States when she was 12. In 2011, she graduated with a Bachelor in Political Science and International Relations and made history by becoming the first Somali American ever elected to the American Congress. 16-year-old Suzanne Zongo fled to Kinshasa from northern Kivu after rebels burnt down her village. She hoped for a better life, but with no parents, she could not afford to go to school. And with no basic education, of course, could not find a decent job. And today can be found selling wares on the streets of Kinshasa for survival. Two girls with similar backgrounds. What is the difference? The difference is, of course, education. Internally displaced and refugee girls are less likely to attend school than boys, especially in conflict settings. And girls are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school than boys. Gender-based violence and harmful practices in fragile conflict and violent settings contribute to educational disparities along gender lines, and this opposes access to education. Education is hope, and it is the torch that lights a better path for a better Africa for millions of girls and women in our continent. When fragility, conflicts, and violence arise, unfortunately, schools are the first to be closed and the last to be reopened, as we can see now. With the impacts of COVID-19, greater stress is on African governments, on policymakers to make advancements in human development, which is really needed. So what are we doing at the African Union International Center for Girls and Women's Education? We have just launched an Africa Educator campaign, which is a rallying call to all our AU member states, to all development partners, to civil society and to youth, to make pledges, and we have received over 200 pledges, to make sure that action is taken to ensure that the girl goes back to school as schools are slowly reopening. Many of our schools in our continent are not opened yet. We cannot ignore the human capital of women and girls in our continent. Half of Africa's capital, half of the potential leading global workforce in 2035, knowing that the workforce in Africa will be the highest in 2035. So the loss of their economic output will go down if they do not access education by 30%. We may not have many Ilhads in Africa, but we have many millions of Susans. Let us complement our efforts and make sure that girls and women in fragile, conflict, and violent contexts get the education that they need. Let us leave no girl behind. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rita. We're now going to go to someone who's joining us online from our investors panel from the European Commission for your reflections on that pitch. Please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon from Brussels. Rita pointed out to the transformative power of education, especially for girls. It's very important. Educated girls are girls who are empowered, skills, have their rights, and contribute to peace and resilience. In crisis and emergency context, educating girls means also that they are better protected from risks of sexual exploitation, forced marriage, or HIV infection. Only 27% of refugee girls are enrolled in secondary schools, and 20 million girls are at risk of dropping out due to conflict and crisis. We urgently need a concerted effort to strengthen girls' education and address the root causes of gender inequality. Without these efforts, we will not be able to meet the SDG 4 objective and the commitments taken this year by the G7 foreign and development ministers. The European Union is fully committed to offer safe and quality education for all children, especially for women and girls who have the least access to a safe education because of conflict, displacement, and we want to give priority to projects with target at least 50% girls. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. So we're going to go back to one more slide and one more pitch presentation that we have. So thank you very much for those comments. And our last pitch is going to also be shared virtually. So over to you, Petra.
Language is at the heart of all human interaction. We use words to express our thoughts, share our experiences, and learn new concepts. Not being able to communicate with others, read signs, or engage in daily tasks can be profoundly disempowering. It increases protection risks and further deepens the distress of displacement. For students and learners, being comfortable with the language used to teach them can easily be the difference between reaching their full potential and falling to the side. And yet, There remains an unmet need to seriously think about language as part of quality education for refugee and displaced learners. Refugees and internally displaced children and youth are often forced to flee to places where the language of instruction is one they do not speak. This affects both access to education and the quality of learning. If language learning needs are not addressed early in an emergency, this can delay or impede access to formal education and can have a critical impact on both retention and educational progression. More needs to be done. There is a need for additional funds to discuss and advance effective curricular and pedagogical strategies, and to converse about available tools and gaps together. This means enhancing efforts for language planning in education in emergency settings. To promote multilingualism, dialogues with community stakeholders are key to deliberate the role of different languages. Promoting multilingual learning opportunities, language support material, and teacher training. These are all examples of interventions that can have a real impact on displaced learners' educational opportunities and future. What is more, such interventions have a multiplier effect, allowing other emergency interventions to be more successful. Governments and donors must invest in research, practical approaches, and supporting rapid language learning. Further research needs to examine actual use of language in refugee camp and displacement settings, and more information is needed on how policymakers and the teaching community can draw on the strengths of multiple languages to boost learning for all. We understand, of course, that there are factors that make this a difficult subject. With language being closely tied to national and political identity, it's important to recognize that language is deeply political and linked to particular challenges. We also need to consider the tension between the importance of home language instruction and the inclusion of displaced learners in national school systems to facilitate school access and retention, all of which are key for children and youth futures. So let's speak sense. Let's have a practical conversation about language, acknowledge the challenges, and propose realistic solutions. We need to highlight language rights as human rights. We need to invest more for refugee and internally displaced children and youth who are likely to undergo instruction in a language they do not understand. We need to think both in terms of structural and relational integration, because building connection with teachers and with communities is as important as classwork. This can often be what enables these children to develop the tools to link their past, present, and future, despite the instability of their situations. We must do all we can to make sure children and young people reach their full potential.
Great. And Danah, if it's all right, I'm going to ask for your reflection on the language challenges.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Petra. Very important and very much needed. I feel that, I've seen it on the ground in both Jordan and Lebanon where we operate. Not only is it language, but also dialect, and understanding the dialect and how that leads to psychosocial issues as well as trauma, as well as not being able to really, continue education. So I feel that it's very, very important topic. I feel it's more important to look at bringing people together and thinking, how do we find this kind of solution, more innovative solution? So yeah, I think to think about that a bit more. But thank you.
Excellent. And now we want to hear from all of you in the audience. So we want to know, out of the 6 pitches that you heard, how would you rank them in terms of what is the highest priority that you think needs greater investment? So we invite you to go to menti.com and you can put in the code 45910010 or scan. And please contribute into letting us know what you think are important areas for investment. And while we do that, I'm going to hand it over to Becky again to facilitate a discussion amongst our investors panel. Over to you, Becky.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the comments that we've had so far. So thinking about the various pitches and there were some really common threads, and I think there were also some quite unusual ways of thinking about things. I'd like us to have a think about 3 questions. So I'll just go through them and then I'm going to open it up to you all. The first one I think is, which of these areas do you think presents an option for a quick win? I mean, we've heard about lots of the longer term approaches, about working with evidence, and about kind of committing to sustainability. But in terms of quick wins and easy solutions, are there things that you think could transform education right now? The second question is around whether there are reasons that investments in some of these areas are yet to materialize. I think they were all extremely compelling, but why maybe haven't they been able to leverage some of that resourcing and that financing that we might expect? And the third one is around the areas on providing opportunities to really transform education. So in terms of the impact and the scale, what do you think are some of those pieces? So let me open up. I'm actually going to ask Mr. Papaconstantinou first, if that's okay, as he's online. Andreas, are you there?
I think that to make education in emergencies more efficient. Can you hear me well? Because I hear an echo. Is the sound okay? Sorry?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So all areas addressed by these pledges, be it innovation, languages, teachers, all of them have to be addressed in a holistic and concerted manner. And investing in education and emergencies and achieving results takes time. But the immediate imperative here is to reopen the schools and bridge learning gaps, and also to rethink the education systems for the long term, involving, and that's essential, all actors, be it governments, the donors, international stakeholders and organizations, communities affected by education disruption and conflict and displacement. COVID-19, unfortunately, has reversed much of recent progress in improving access to education and gender equality. These are very important issues. It has aggravated the learning crisis with huge increases in inequalities, in the digital divide, and psychological and mental issues. We have to move now from a COVID-19 worldwide learning crisis to recovery efforts and to strengthening the resilience of education systems. And we need sustained investment in education as a sector, and a shift towards greater coherence in the global aid architecture for education, bringing together us, the humanitarian branch, and also development. Here in the EU, we have the 10% investment target in education, both in the humanitarian world and in development aid instruments. And it is for us an opportunity to maximize the impact in promoting quality and inclusive education. So to address the learning gaps and bring all children, especially girls, that's a special focus of ours, back to learning, we need to learn lessons, important lessons from these crises. And investing in inclusion, equality, and remote and hybrid education solutions has the potential to transform the future of learning. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And I think we should all be inspired by the European Commission's commitment to education and to education in emergencies in particular. I mean, I think there was set out there some of these really big challenges that we're talking about, but also the impact that COVID has had. You know, we've talked about the learning crisis, we've talked about schools being closed. Within that situation, are there quick wins? Danah, maybe I can turn to you.
Yes, I mean, quick wins is also a difficult thing to answer, because when we're talking about refugee education and we're talking about investing in refugee education and we want a quick win, I sometimes feel a bit there is no quick win. But I feel that right now, when we talk about crisis, we talk about what's happening around us, is that what COVID has done is only expose the digital divide and how it is widening, and we need to really, it's almost like an alert or an alarm for us to actually look at that, and I feel that that's extremely important, is particularly the hidden costs that Lauren was talking about, and how to connect. Gender, also, I feel that COVID has also exposed that to an extent that is actually quite scary, where girls are not able to connect online because it's not seen as culturally appropriate, etc. And I feel that once we get into gender, particularly looking at getting the parents on board, getting the community on board, and creating awareness on the importance of education, not only for now, but for the future, so the more long term. And then the last one is, I feel the teachers, and thank you for that, were forgotten in a sense somehow, because I've spoken to so many teachers that have said, okay, we put on the laptop, we're looking at all these students and we don't know what to do, so we just do what we did in the classroom. But once we've trained teachers in one of our programs in Lebanon, you see that they're able to transform, and I feel that's very important. Do I go on to the second one, or do we look at quick wins only? Yeah. The second one I was thinking about is the question that you spoke about of why this has not been, leveraged financially as well, is sometimes I feel that because we're thinking about what do we do now, and because the crises that have happened is not just one, and it's the COVID pandemic hits globally, and so each country was looking at how they support their own. But when we look at refugee education, it's not just one crisis that happened. It's added on to something that was already there, multiple crises, if you like. And also what it exaggerated or exacerbated, I can't say that word, sorry. But in our host communities, we already had poverty, unemployment, etc. And the pandemic hit, thinking, let's put refugee education on the side, in a sense, So I feel that we need to look at it from a different angle and bring that back on the agenda, and looking at what are the long-term effects. I know that we need humanitarian assistance for sure, but us as donors, we need to coordinate. And we did that with the Abdulaziz Al Ghurair Refugee Education Fund, and thinking, okay, you are humanitarian assistance, you can do that. We look at the long-term education, we can support this later and get with other donors as well. And I feel that the last point of impact to transform education, I think it's always keeping our eyes on the longer vision. And whether it's the teachers program, I really thought that the digital connectivity was very important, particularly not forgetting to engage the private sector and the corporate sector, particularly with the fintech. And we think of all these different edtechs and where we want the refugees to go. If they can't open bank accounts, they can't get jobs, then it's not going to help them in the long run. And I feel that that's what we need to look at, is that quick win sort of pathway to the long term, if you like.
Thank you. And I think they're all really interesting points, because there's, sometimes, like you say, we do look for a quick win, and particularly when you're working with funders and donors, going to someone and saying, actually, we don't have an exit plan at this point. We need you to fund us for 10 years until we get to scale, can be quite challenging. But I think, as you said, maybe instead of thinking about quick wins, we can think about tweaks in the system. So, is it about registration or bank accounts, or just recognizing someone as a key player, bringing in a new partner from the private sector? And so thinking about those kind of individual moments and how they create real change. Nada, I'm interested to hear from Dubai Cares, reflecting on those points.
Thank you. So I'm going to build on what my colleague Danah mentioned, and actually specifically the point around connectivity. So we're realizing really, and I think these conversations started with UNHCR and other partners of ours previous to COVID, but COVID kind of helped us accelerate, which is the need for connectivity as a right. So within the right to education, the right to connectivity for education. And so that's definitely an immediate priority, and I think everyone should be working towards that. But To answer the question, or to contribute to the question of why some priorities haven't received financing, I think because some of them, and you mentioned this earlier, there is a need for long-term investment, longer grants, not just the 2 to 3 year grants that we typically give as funders. And specifically when you're, for example, addressing a topic like refugee leadership, there needs to be, it's not just the funding that you're going to provide them with, but you need to provide them with support. You need to give them capacity building. You need to help them build a network, connect them to other people, and that takes time. That's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Euan, interested to hear from you. I mean, I think you also raised some additional points in that. So, you know, coming to this question of what is it that provides opportunities to really transform education? You know, what do we see which is working? How do we build on that evidence? And why are some of those things that we know work not receiving the kind of investment that they need?
Sure, and I think, I mean, if I start with, I agree, I don't think quick wins is necessarily the right thing, but I think there's good starting points as well, and I think how we look at a focus on teacher buy-in particularly is really important, and on adoption of innovative approaches to holistic outcomes is really key as well. So I think while not a quick win, it's definitely a really good starting point. We know as well that play-based methods within that are really easy to apply across academic disciplines as well, and that the great advantage of play-based learning as well is that it really helps with the social, emotional and well-being and mental health of children. And I think we saw some great examples in some of the pitches today. If I was to look at why I think maybe some investment is not happening, I suspect that larger investments in things like EdTech are not there because there's still some cynicism around the long-term sustainability of it. And I think we need more research into the EdTech. How do we make that EdTech more systemic? How do we avoid it just not being a technology dump, as I think sometimes it's seen? And so I also think we saw some great ideas there. And when we can get ed technology to demonstrate systemic impact, I think we'll see more money flowing there. And on the third question around the opportunity to really transform the education for displaced learners, what really stood out for me is the inclusion of the vulnerable groups themselves, to making sure that girls and refugee communities are really involved in the design, the decision-making, and the delivery of those programs. And again, I think we saw plenty of that in the pitches today. I think all of the pitches brought various aspects of this together.
Great, thank you so much. We just have a couple more minutes, and so I actually want to take a couple of the things that you've mentioned and reflect on them a bit further. And so one of them is around how do we encourage, facilitate, and incentivize, you know, having refugees at the center of these kind of solutions, not just refugees, but actually recognizing the human assets who are there and really valuing them. So we also talked about classroom teachers. And the other question, I think, is around how do we invest in evidence? Evidence has come up, I think, in all of the pitches, but also looking at not just how do we invest in it, but how do we collectively as stakeholders, you know, set the kind of tone, set the quality, and ensure that we're using it. So very quickly, Danah, you're right if I go back to you? Oh, microphone. Sorry. I think they just turn it on.
How to invest in evidence is very important. I mean, for us, we are an evidence-led organization, impact-led, but as well is that we need to be very, as donors I'm talking about, we need to be patient, we need to be flexible and adaptive. And the biggest example is Lebanon. You know, what our plan that we had started with, October 18th came, school closures before Corona, you know, and then COVID hit, and then economic crisis. And so what we needed to do was to ensure not only that our partners have a voice, but the young people have that just awareness, their parents have the awareness, the community have that sort of engagement that they're allowed to participate in. I think it's bringing them into the discussions and into the research is very important. There's still a lack of research on refugee education, and particularly I'm talking about the Arab world. A lot of focus has not been highlighted about that, and I feel that we need to get together to be able to not only do research from a top down, but really come from a bottom up approach.
And to build on Danah's point, I think something we're all guilty of is, despite the little or whatever little research that we have, usually we don't go back to the communities and share it with them so that they can learn how they can also improve. It usually sits within the organizations who are conducting the research, or us sitting here and talking about it. So we need to get better about thinking about how to go back and help them use it.
Thanks, and I think just to add to that, we found at the foundation, at the LEGO Foundation, we're re-looking at how we do evidence, because I think it's been hugely onerous, very much driven by us, and not necessarily always particularly helpful or useful to change things. And some of the thinking we're doing there is really much more around learning questions and learning horizons. So not necessarily what's the long-term evidence generation, but what do we need to know now or quickly to make the next really good decision? So really kind of rethinking the timescales. And to the points that have been made, involving the people that are impacted by it. So making sure it isn't just top-down, it really is bottom-up. And I think that also to the point around how do we facilitate more the inclusion, that's really on us and all of us who fund, all of us who partner to make sure that the right people are in the design phase, are giving that input. And I think all of us are guilty of not doing that. I know at the LEGO Foundation, we rarely remember the voice of children in some of our grant designs. So bringing those in and those end users, the beneficiaries, I think is absolutely critical, and we should all challenge ourselves to be better at that.
Thank you so much. We're going to close out there, and then I'll hand back to Jackie. I just wanted to add 2 points. I think the thing that comes out so strongly is not just leave nobody behind, but leave nobody behind in all of the different things that we do, whether it's building evidence or having a say or co-designing. And the other one, as Judith said, is, to transform things, we have to work through complexity and we have to stick with it. And be ready to transform not just the education sector, but even when that is uncomfortably, our own organizations and our own approaches. Jackie.
Okay, perfect. So we've heard from all of you, and the top 3 pitches that got the highest rankings are teacher training and high impact practice. Big round of applause, yes. Investments in education of African girls. And the importance of funding the missing middle. And I think we can give all of the presenters, both those that presented via video and online, another huge round of applause. Congratulations. I think it's true from what also our investor panel said, that investments in all of these areas are really needed. And so we encourage all of you to find out more. We will be sharing all of the videos from the pitches that were submitted. We received over 24. So if you go to the Global Compact refugees.org site, you'll find a blog of this session coming very shortly with a presentation of the various different pitches from a variety of partners. So thank you very much to our investors panel. Another round of applause, please, for our investors. And thank you for everyone in the room who joined us today and those joining online. We encourage you to stay put for the next session that will also focus on the Refugee Connected Education Challenge, picking up on some of the EdTech conversations that emerged earlier. So thank you, and I wish you all a wonderful day.